Before we dive into this fascinating alternative history exploration, please take a moment to support our channel by hitting that like button if you find this content informative. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. We love connecting with our global community of history enthusiasts. The summer of 1940 stands as one of history's most precarious moments, when the balance between freedom and tyranny hung by the thinnest of threads. Following Germany's stunning victories across Western Europe, Adolf Hitler found himself master of a continent stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea. Yet Britain remained defiant, protected by 21 miles of English Channel waters that had safeguarded the island nation for nearly a millennium. The failure of Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned invasion of Britain, represents perhaps the most critical juncture in determining the war's ultimate outcome. Hitler's Directive No. 16, issued on July 16, 1940, outlined 4 essential conditions for the invasion to proceed: the complete suppression of the Royal Air Force, the clearing of British mines from the English Channel, domination of the coastal zone by heavy artillery, and the neutralization of the Royal Navy. Had these conditions been met, the course of world history would have been irrevocably altered. The strategic importance of Britain's survival cannot be overstated. The island nation served as an unsinkable aircraft carrier from which Allied forces could launch their eventual return to continental Europe. Its industrial capacity, naval supremacy, and global empire provided the resources necessary to sustain a prolonged conflict against the Axis powers. More importantly, Britain's resistance inspired hope among occupied peoples across Europe and demonstrated that German military might was not invincible. Consider the ramifications had the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority during the Battle of Britain. Without radar stations guiding RAF fighters to intercept incoming bomber formations, German aircraft could have systematically destroyed British industrial centres, ports and airfields. The Royal Navy, deprived of air cover, would have found itself vulnerable to coordinated attacks by German submarines, surface vessels and dive bombers. With Britain's defensive capabilities crippled, German invasion barges could have crossed the Channel under protective air cover, establishing beachheads along the southern English coast. The psychological impact of Britain's fall would have reverberated across the globe. Winston Churchill's stirring speeches about fighting on the beaches and never surrendering would have been replaced by the grim reality of occupation. The British Empire, spanning 1/4 of the world's landmass, would have faced an uncertain future. Dominions like Canada, Australia, and South Africa might have sought separate peace agreements, while India's independence movement could have aligned itself with Axis promises of liberation from European colonial rule. Another critical turning point lay on the Eastern Front, where Operation Barbarossa initially caught Soviet forces completely unprepared. The German advance toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941 came tantalizingly close to success, before being halted by fierce Soviet resistance and the brutal Russian winter. Had German forces captured the Soviet capital before winter set in, Stalin's government might have collapsed, taking with it the industrial capacity and manpower that ultimately proved decisive in defeating Nazi Germany. The entry of the United States into the conflict following Pearl Harbor provided the Allies with the industrial and technological resources necessary to sustain global warfare. America's vast manufacturing capacity, protected by 2 oceans from enemy attack, could produce aircraft, ships, and military equipment at a rate that Axis powers could never match. However, had Japan refrained from attacking Pearl Harbor, American public opinion might have remained divided about direct involvement in European affairs, potentially allowing Germany to consolidate its gains before facing renewed Allied opposition. These pivotal moments remind us how contingent historical outcomes truly are. Small changes in timing, weather conditions, or command decisions could have produced vastly different results. The margin between Allied victory and Axis triumph was often measured in hours rather than days, making the actual outcome all the more remarkable and precious. As we examine these crucial junctures, we begin to understand how close the world came to a dramatically different future. The failure of Operation Sea Lion, the resilience of the Soviet Union, and America's entry into the war created the conditions for Allied victory. But what if these events had unfolded differently? What kind of world would have emerged from German triumph? The Nazi vision for a conquered Europe extended far beyond simple military occupation. Heinrich Himmler and other SS leaders had developed comprehensive plans for the complete reorganization of the continent, according to racial ideology and German economic interests. The concept of the New Order represented a fundamental restructuring of European civilization, with devastating consequences for millions of people. At the heart of this transformation lay the establishment of a greater Germanic Reich that would encompass not only Germany, but virtually all of historically Germanic Europe, except Great Britain. This expanded empire would have reduced formerly independent nations to mere provinces of the Third Reich, similar to how Austria had been incorporated as the Ostmark following the Anschluss. The process of Gleichschaltung, or synchronization, would have systematically eliminated all traces of national consciousness among conquered peoples, replacing their cultural identities with loyalty to the German state. The implementation of this vision began with Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, which served as more than just a military campaign against the Soviet Union. The invasion represented the first phase of General Plan Ost, the master plan for the East, which outlined the racial reorganization of European Russia and Eastern Europe. Under this scheme, the existing Slavic populations would face systematic elimination through various means, including forced starvation, slave labor, and direct extermination, making way for German settlers who would establish new communities in the conquered territories. The scale of this planned demographic engineering defies comprehension. Nazi planners envisioned the establishment of settlements capable of hosting 10 million German colonists across Eastern Europe. These village complexes would each accommodate 300 to 400 Germanic settlers, creating a vast network of German communities stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The native populations, categorized as subhuman in Nazi ideology, would either be eliminated entirely or reduced to a slave labor force serving their German masters. Economic exploitation formed another crucial component of the new order. The Nazi leadership viewed conquered territories primarily as sources of raw materials and agricultural products to support the German war machine and feed the German population. France, despite its partial occupation, found itself subjected to systematic economic exploitation through the armistice conditions imposed in June 1940. The German occupation authorities extracted vast quantities of food, manufactured goods, and raw materials, leaving French civilians to subsist on increasingly meager rations. The concept of autarky, or economic self-sufficiency, drove much of German economic planning during this period. Nazi economists recognized that Germany lacked many essential raw materials necessary for sustained industrial production and military operations. The conquest of Eastern Europe would have provided access to vast agricultural lands, oil fields, and mineral deposits that could support German ambitions for continental domination. However, achieving true autarky remained elusive even with territorial expansion, as Germany continued to depend on imports of certain critical materials throughout the war. Cultural transformation accompanied economic exploitation in Nazi-occupied territories. The German authorities systematically suppressed local languages, traditions, and educational systems, replacing them with German culture and Nazi ideology. Museums, libraries, and universities faced closure or reorganization to serve German interests. Artistic and intellectual works deemed incompatible with Nazi values were destroyed or confiscated, while German settlers received priority access to educational opportunities and cultural institutions. The resistance movements that emerged across occupied Europe would have faced even greater challenges under a victorious Nazi regime. Organizations like the French Maquis, Norwegian Resistance, and Polish Home Army demonstrated remarkable courage in opposing German occupation, but they operated with the knowledge that Allied forces might eventually liberate their countries. In a world where Germany had achieved complete victory, such resistance movements would have confronted the prospect of permanent occupation with no hope of external assistance. The treatment of different ethnic and religious groups varied according to Nazi racial classifications, but all non-Germanic peoples faced subordination under the new order. Jews, Roma, and other groups targeted for extermination would have faced complete annihilation in territories under permanent German control. Slavic peoples would have been reduced to slave labor status, while Western Europeans might have enjoyed slightly better treatment if they demonstrated loyalty to the German state and accepted their position within the racial hierarchy. Religious institutions would have faced systematic suppression or coordination with Nazi ideology. The German Christian movement attempted to align Protestant churches with Nazi racial theories, while the Catholic Church would have found itself under increasing pressure to conform to state ideology. Traditional Christian teachings about human dignity and universal brotherhood directly contradicted Nazi racial doctrines, making conflict between religious and secular authorities inevitable. This vision of European transformation reveals the totalitarian scope of Nazi ambitions. The new order represented not merely political conquest, but the complete reshaping of European civilization according to German racial and ideological principles. The implications of such transformation would have extended far beyond Europe itself, affecting global trade relationships, colonial empires, and the balance of world power. The establishment of Nazi hegemony over Europe would have fundamentally altered the global balance of power, creating a world dominated by three major spheres of influence: a German-controlled Europe, an American-dominated Western Hemisphere, and a Japanese empire spanning much of East Asia and the Pacific. This tripartite division would have replaced the British Empire as the organizing principle of international relations, ushering in an era of unprecedented geopolitical tension. The United States, despite its vast industrial capacity and geographic isolation, would have found itself in a precarious strategic position. Without British bases for staging operations against occupied Europe, American military planners would have faced the daunting prospect of directly confronting a consolidated Nazi empire across the Atlantic. The development of long-range aircraft and rocket technology by German scientists could have threatened American cities, forcing the United States to divert enormous resources toward continental defense. The Nazi nuclear program, led by scientists like Werner Heisenberg, might have achieved success under conditions of prolonged German control over European resources and research facilities. With access to uranium deposits in occupied Czechoslovakia and the technical expertise of captured physicists from across Europe, German researchers could have developed atomic weapons before the United States completed the Manhattan Project. Such a development would have given Nazi Germany a decisive strategic advantage and fundamentally altered the post-war global order. Japanese expansion in the Pacific would have proceeded without significant opposition from European colonial powers. The Dutch East Indies, French Indochina, and British possessions in Southeast Asia would have fallen under Japanese control by default, as their metropolitan governments either collaborated with Germany or lacked the resources to defend distant territories. This expanded Japanese empire would have controlled the vast majority of global rubber, tin, and oil production outside the Western Hemisphere, creating potential conflicts with both German and American interests. The fate of the British Empire presents one of the most complex aspects of this alternative scenario. Even if Britain itself had fallen to German invasion, the dominions and colonial territories might have continued resistance from other locations. Canada, protected by its proximity to the United States, could have served as a base for continued British government operations. Australia and New Zealand, facing the immediate threat of Japanese expansion, might have sought American protection while maintaining nominal loyalty to the British Crown. India's independence movement would have faced dramatically different circumstances under German hegemony in Europe. Nazi ideologists viewed Indians as racially superior to most other colonial peoples, and German propaganda frequently emphasized the hypocrisy of British opposition to German racial policies while maintaining colonial rule over hundreds of millions of non-Europeans. Subhas Chandra Bose and other Indian nationalist leaders who collaborated with Germany and Japan during the actual war might have found themselves in positions of greater influence within an Axis-dominated Asia. The economic implications of German victory would have been equally profound. The Nazi concept of Großwirtschaftsraum, or greater economic space, envisioned the creation of a self-sufficient economic bloc spanning continental Europe and potentially extending into Africa and the Middle East. This autarkic system would have disrupted traditional patterns of international trade and investment, forcing other world regions to develop alternative economic relationships. African territories under European colonial rule would have experienced varying fates depending on their colonial masters' relationships with Germany. French colonies might have been integrated into the German economic sphere through the Vichy government's collaboration, while British territories could have faced direct German occupation or administration through cooperative local authorities. The strategic importance of the Suez Canal and Middle Eastern oil fields would have made these regions prime targets for German expansion. Latin American countries would have confronted difficult choices between accommodation with the new European order and closer alignment with the United States. German communities in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile might have served as focal points for Nazi influence, while countries with stronger democratic traditions could have found themselves under increasing pressure to choose sides in the emerging Cold War between German-dominated Europe and the American-led Western Hemisphere. The technological development that occurred during the actual World War II might have proceeded along different lines under German hegemony. German research into jet propulsion, rocket technology, and synthetic fuels was among the most advanced in the world during the 1940s. With unlimited access to European resources and scientific talent, German researchers might have achieved breakthroughs in space exploration, nuclear physics, and other fields decades earlier than occurred in our timeline. Cultural and intellectual exchange between world regions would have been severely restricted under a Nazi-dominated international system. The free movement of ideas, artistic works, and scientific knowledge that characterized the post-war liberal international order would have been replaced by ideological barriers and state-controlled information flows. Universities, research institutions, and cultural organizations would have faced pressure to conform to prevailing political orthodoxies or risk losing access to international networks. This transformed global landscape would have created conditions for eventual conflict between the major power blocs. The fundamental incompatibility between Nazi racial ideology and American democratic principles would have made peaceful coexistence extremely difficult to maintain over the long term. Competition for influence in neutral regions, access to strategic resources, and technological supremacy would have created numerous potential flashpoints for future conflicts. Under German victory, the trajectory of technological and scientific development would have followed dramatically different paths, potentially accelerating certain fields while suppressing others according to Nazi ideological priorities and military needs. The concentration of European scientific talent under German control, combined with virtually unlimited access to continental resources, would have created unprecedented opportunities for technological advancement in areas deemed strategically important by the Nazi leadership. German rocket technology, already the world's most advanced by 1945, would likely have achieved remarkable breakthroughs under conditions of continued research and development. The V2 rocket program, led by Werner von Braun and his team at Peenemünde, represented only the beginning of German ambitions in missile technology. With sustained funding and access to materials from across occupied Europe, German engineers might have developed intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching American cities, fundamentally altering the strategic balance between the major power blocs. The German nuclear program, despite its actual limitations during the war, might have achieved success under different circumstances. Werner Heisenberg and other German physicists possessed the theoretical knowledge necessary for atomic weapon development, but lacked sufficient resources and faced organizational challenges that hampered their progress. A victorious Nazi regime would have had access to uranium deposits in occupied Czechoslovakia, the technical expertise of physicists from across Europe, and the industrial capacity necessary for large-scale uranium enrichment and weapon production. Jet propulsion technology, in which Germany held a significant early advantage, would have continued advancing under German leadership. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, demonstrated German superiority in this crucial field. Continued development might have produced jet aircraft capable of intercontinental range, giving Germany the ability to project air power across the Atlantic and challenge American air superiority over the Western Hemisphere. German research into synthetic fuels and materials would have received massive investment under a victorious Nazi regime. The development of synthetic rubber, petroleum products, and other strategic materials from coal and other domestic resources formed a crucial component of Nazi autarkic planning. With access to the vast coal deposits of occupied Poland and other Eastern European territories, German chemists might have perfected synthetic production methods that could have made the Greater Germanic Reich truly self-sufficient in strategic materials. Medical and biological research would have proceeded along disturbing lines under continued Nazi rule. The regime's emphasis on racial hygiene and population control would have directed scientific resources toward research supporting Nazi ideological objectives. However, the suppression of Jewish and other undesirable scientists would have severely hampered progress in many fields, as some of the world's most brilliant minds would have been eliminated or forced to flee to other countries. The development of electronic computing and information processing, fields in which German engineers made important early contributions, might have advanced more rapidly under German hegemony. Konrad Zeuss's pioneering work on mechanical and electronic computers represented cutting-edge research that could have been expanded with adequate funding and resources. German superiority in precision engineering and manufacturing would have provided advantages in developing increasingly sophisticated electronic systems. Industrial production methods would have been revolutionized through the application of German organizational principles and technological innovations. The concept of total industrial mobilization, implemented during the later stages of the actual war, would have been refined and perfected under conditions of permanent German control over European manufacturing capacity. This could have produced unprecedented levels of industrial efficiency and output, supporting continued technological advancement and military expansion. Transportation technology would have evolved to serve the needs of the Greater Germanic Empire. The development of high-speed rail networks, advanced highway systems, and improved shipping technologies would have facilitated the movement of people, goods, and military forces across the vast European territories under German control. German engineers' expertise in infrastructure development would have created transportation networks designed to serve both civilian and military purposes. Agricultural science and technology would have focused on supporting the demographic transformation envisioned in General Plan Ost. Research into crop yields, soil improvement, and mechanized farming methods would have aimed at maximizing food production in territories designated for German settlement. The displacement of existing agricultural populations would have created opportunities for implementing advanced farming techniques on a continental scale. Communication technologies would have been developed primarily to serve state control and propaganda purposes. German advances in radio broadcasting, television transmission, and other mass communication methods would have been refined to maximize their effectiveness in maintaining ideological control over the population. The development of sophisticated surveillance and monitoring technologies would have supported the totalitarian apparatus necessary to maintain control over such a vast empire. Scientific education and research institutions would have been reorganized according to Nazi ideological principles. Universities and research facilities across occupied Europe would have been integrated into a German-controlled system designed to serve the technological needs of the Reich while indoctrinating future generations of scientists and engineers in Nazi racial theories. This centralized approach might have produced rapid advances in selected fields while severely limiting intellectual freedom and creativity. The suppression of international scientific cooperation would have profoundly affected the pace and direction of technological development. The free exchange of ideas and research findings that characterizes modern scientific progress would have been replaced by state-controlled information flows designed to maintain German technological superiority. This isolation might have ultimately hindered German scientific progress, while spurring competing research efforts in other world regions. Despite the terrifying efficiency of Nazi organizational methods and the vast resources at their disposal, a victorious German empire would have contained within itself the seeds of its own eventual destruction. The fundamental contradictions inherent in Nazi ideology, combined with the practical challenges of governing such a vast and diverse territory, would have created insurmountable problems that no amount of military force or technological advancement could have solved permanently. The economic foundation of the Nazi system would have proven unsustainable over the long term. The regime's dependence on constant expansion and exploitation of conquered territories created a dynamic that required continuous growth to maintain stability. Once the limits of expansion were reached, either through geographic constraints or resistance from other major powers, the economic model would have begun to break down. The extraction of resources from occupied territories could not continue indefinitely without investment in infrastructure and productive capacity, but such investment would have conflicted with the racial ideology that viewed non-Germanic peoples as expendable slave labor. Demographic challenges would have posed an existential threat to Nazi plans for European reorganization. The systematic elimination of Slavic populations envisioned in General Plan Ost would have removed the very workforce necessary to maintain agricultural and industrial production in the conquered territories. German birth rates, already declining during the 1930s, would not have produced sufficient population to replace the eliminated Slavic peoples, while simultaneously providing settlers for the vast Eastern European territories designated for colonization. Internal resistance within the Nazi apparatus would have intensified as the regime matured and faced new challenges. The rivalries between different Nazi organizations, the SS, the regular military and civilian administrators that characterized the actual Nazi state, would have become more pronounced under conditions of permanent rule over a continental empire. Competition for resources, ideological disputes, and personal ambitions would have created fault lines that could have been exploited by opposition movements or external enemies. The technological advantages that might have initially favored a victorious Nazi Germany would have been temporary at best. Scientific and technological progress depends fundamentally on intellectual freedom, international cooperation, and the free exchange of ideas. The Nazi emphasis on ideological conformity and racial purity would have gradually undermined the innovative capacity that produced German technological leadership during the early war years. The expulsion or elimination of Jewish and other undesirable scientists would have created a brain drain that could not have been permanently compensated by forced labor or ideological indoctrination. Religious and cultural resistance would have posed a persistent challenge to Nazi authority. The attempt to replace traditional Christian values with Nazi ideology would have encountered deep-rooted opposition from religious communities across Europe. The Catholic Church, Protestant denominations, and Orthodox Christianity all possessed institutional structures and spiritual authority that could have served as focal points for resistance against totalitarian control. The Nazi attempt to create a purely secular, racially based belief system would have conflicted with centuries of European religious tradition. The educational system required to maintain Nazi ideology across multiple generations would have faced inherent contradictions. Technical and scientific education necessary for continued technological advancement requires critical thinking and intellectual curiosity, qualities that conflict with the blind obedience and ideological conformity demanded by totalitarian systems. The tension between producing competent technical specialists and loyal ideological followers would have created ongoing problems for the regime's long-term stability. International isolation would have severely handicapped the Nazi Empire's long-term prospects. Even if Germany had achieved hegemony over Europe, the regime would have faced persistent hostility from the United States, the Soviet Union, if any remnant survived, and other powers. This isolation would have limited access to resources, technologies, and markets outside the German sphere, creating vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by hostile powers. The administrative challenges of governing such a vast territory with diverse populations would have overwhelmed even the most efficient bureaucratic system. The Nazi state's reliance on terror and coercion as primary methods of control would have required enormous resources and constant vigilance to maintain. As the initial generation of Nazi leaders aged and died, their replacements might have lacked the ideological commitment or practical experience necessary to maintain the system's coherence. Economic competition from other world regions would have posed an ongoing threat to German dominance. The United States, with its vast natural resources and technological capabilities, would have continued developing advanced industrial and military technologies. A free and prosperous America would have served as a constant reminder to Europeans of alternative ways of organizing society, potentially inspiring resistance movements and undermining the legitimacy of Nazi rule. The environmental consequences of Nazi economic policies would have created additional long-term problems. The exploitation of natural resources without regard for sustainability, combined with the industrial pollution generated by war production and heavy industry, would have degraded the environmental foundation necessary for continued prosperity. Climate change, soil depletion, and water pollution would have posed challenges that the Nazi system was ideologically incapable of addressing effectively. Ultimately, the Nazi vision of a 1,000-year Reich would have proved as ephemeral as all previous attempts to establish permanent empire through force and ideology. The human desire for freedom, dignity, and self-determination cannot be permanently suppressed, regardless of the efficiency of the oppressive apparatus. The contradictions inherent in Nazi ideology and practice would have eventually produced the conditions for the system's collapse, though the cost in human suffering would have been incalculable. The The study of this alternative history serves not as an exercise in speculation, but as a reminder of the precious nature of the freedom and democracy that emerged from the actual outcome of World War II. The Allied victory, achieved at enormous cost in lives and resources, preserved the possibility of human progress based on cooperation rather than domination, diversity rather than uniformity, and hope rather than fear. As we conclude this exploration of alternative history, we must acknowledge the profound debt owed to those who ensured that the nightmare scenario we have examined remained forever in the realm of speculation rather than reality. The brave men and women who fought against fascism, whether on distant battlefields or in occupied territories, preserved the possibility of the world we know today. The actual outcome of World War II, with all its imperfections and ongoing challenges, represents one of humanity's greatest triumphs over organized evil. The establishment of international institutions dedicated to preventing future conflicts, the recognition of universal human rights, and the gradual expansion of democratic governance across much of the world would have been impossible under the alternative scenario we have explored. The technological and scientific advances that have transformed human life since 1945 occurred within a framework of international cooperation and intellectual freedom that could never have existed under Nazi hegemony. The space race, medical breakthroughs, and communication technologies that define our modern world emerged from the free exchange of ideas and peaceful competition between democratic societies. Yet this examination of alternative history also serves as a warning about the fragility of human progress and the constant vigilance required to preserve freedom and dignity. The forces that produced fascism in the 20th century have not disappeared from the world, and each generation must recommit itself to the values that made Allied victory possible and meaningful. The world we have inherited, shaped by the actual outcome of World War II rather than the alternative we have explored, offers both remarkable achievements and ongoing challenges. The responsibility of preserving and extending the legacy of those who defeated fascism remains with us, requiring continued commitment to the principles of human dignity, international cooperation, and peaceful resolution of conflicts that they fought to establish. In remembering what might have been, we better appreciate what we have become and what we must continue to strive to be. The price of freedom, as we have seen through this exploration of alternative history, is indeed eternal vigilance, and the alternative to that vigilance is too terrible to contemplate.